There are over 300,000 species of plant known to be alive today. Um, of these, there aren't that many which are ferns or mosses and liverworts, or even pine trees, with fewer than 1,000 gymnosperms known, for example. The overwhelming majority of these plants are the angiosperms, the flowering plants. Now, obviously, with that many species, close to 300,000, that's far too much to treat. But I have a number of videos which look at some of the interesting aspects of them and look at certain aspects of their diversity. So this video is meant to just kind of introduce some of my students to some of the other videos that I've made and why these might then be helpful. And so then to proceed, what variations do we see in the flowering plants? Well, first off, many of them are pollinated by the wind. And so whether this be grass or oak trees, they don't have obvious flowers with bright petals, etc. Of the ones that do, one might notice that the form of the structure varies. So some of them are rather open, and the portions of the flower which would have the pollen and the female ovary, they're rather easy to get to. And interestingly, flowers have structures which match the pollinators that they are attempting to attract. So this is fairly easy to reach. So some pollinators don't have great adaptation. So here's a fly, for example. I know it looks like a bee, but it's actually a fly that looks like a bee. Beetles, ants, they most easily access rather open flowers. All right, so here you can see a beetle in, once again, a rather open flower, once again. But then there are flowers which want to be choosier, where they want a specific pollinator then to visit them. So for example, if a pollinator were to go from this flower to this flower, the sperm and the pollen grains from this flower are deposited on this flower, and thus that's wasted energy, because obviously this pollen is not going to fertilize this flower or vice versa. And so many flowers attempt to specialize, and thus to increase the fidelity in which a pollinator will visit that flower only. And so when you look at a flower, its form often suggests, here once again is a fly. Even I know it looks like a bee, but it's there are hoverflies. Butterflies are different in that they have this long proboscis. And so many flowers are more difficult to access. And so therefore it is the flowers which have more of a tubular structure that butterflies are better adapted to pollinate. Some flowers don't look overly attractive. They kind of maybe even look like rotting flesh. They may actually even then smell like rotting flesh. And then these can be pollinated by flies, right? So sometimes you smell a flower and it smells like sweat, or it doesn't have a pleasing odor. It smells a little off, but rather than trying to attract, say, a bee, instead it's trying to attract a fly. Bees are rather strong as pollinators go. And so a lot of the flowers pollinated by bees require some strength to force into where the nectar is. As I'll go through with flower color, bees prefer the colors blue and yellow, and then they can even see ultraviolet light. And so there are flowers which have patterning which we cannot perceive, but that the bees can. And then very often they have kind of guidelines to help guide the bees to where the nectar is, but then also where the pollen is. Notice here on these flowers that the parts which have the pollen, these are the male parts, or the part that is to be deposited, where the pollen is to be deposited, the female parts are held far away from the plant. So something like a hummingbird, all right, which is going to hover near the plant, that flower is designed to be pollinated by hummingbirds. Hummingbirds and butterflies see red flowers that something like a bee might perceive as black. And so when we look at the diversity of flowers, it's not random. Very often the structure of the flowers and the color of the flowers are an adaptation to help specific pollinators, and then to promote pollinator fidelity. As we look at flowering plants, there are just oh so many variations we could consider. So almost in random order. While many plants are photosynthetic and are independent, others, to varying degrees, might parasitize other other plants. So here you see a plant growing on a tree. It is a parasite in a way because the tree has invested all of this energy into maintaining a strong stem. This moss is not doing that. It's not true moss. That's just a thing. So it's taking advantage of the tree's investment in a strong trunk and growing over it. But obviously, the more of this parasitic epiphyte that there is, this now blocks the light that gets to the tree's leaves, and then even can create so much weight that the tree, the limbs can break. Some plants aren't even photosynthetic. So this is a flowering plant, even though it looks white. It's not actually getting energy through photosynthesis, but rather it's tapping into the extensions of the roots. Most plants have an interaction with fungi, where the fungi extend from the plant roots and help to gather water and minerals. And these plants then tap into those extensions from other plants. So in essence, they're parasitizing the mycorrhizal, that's the system of fungi associated with plant roots. So they're parasitizing those other plant root systems. So there's an example of a variation where these plants aren't even performing photosynthesis. Plants can vary in how they disperse seeds. So many plants want their young to be successful, but not in the vicinity of the parent tree. Because if they were successful in the vicinity of the parent tree, so for example, here's the parent tree. If the young grow up around the parent tree, they are then competing for sunlight, for water, for nutrients, and obviously that's not helping the parent tree much. And so many plants have adaptations to take plants or take seeds far from the plant. So some plants wrap their seeds in a fruit, and the fruit is not for the plant's benefit necessarily, but to attract an animal that might then take the fruit and, like maybe a squirrel, bury it for later, but these might germinate. Or in the case of many fruits, be fruits which say birds eat, and then the fruit along with the seeds pass through the bird's digestive system and then are excreted far from the parent plant. And so why is this plant giving food for birds? Well, it wants the bird to eat its seeds, which have the embryos of its offspring. But the embryos are protected by these resistant coats to pass through the digestive system of the bird unharmed. But the bird will then transport the seed far away. And so this plant is going to enlist this animal to help it disperse its seeds. Some seeds are dispersed by wind, and one can observe a variety of structures, which can catch the wind and allow the seeds to be blown far from the parent plant. And then other seeds are surrounded by adhesive structures, which might say catch a mammal's fur, or you might notice them like adhering to your pant leg if you walk in the woods. If a mammal walks past them, they can adhere to the fur of the mammal and then come loose at a later point. Some seeds are dispersed by water. So coconuts, for example, and palm trees can make seeds which are meant now to float in water. That's why coconuts are so big, because they might have to float for a while before they're lucky enough to land on an island. So another thing that causes some plants to vary from others is how they disperse their seeds. Some plants, instead of getting nitrogen from the soil, try to supplement nitrogen and other energy sources by actually digesting insects. So they try to trap insects in fluids or trapped rainwater. Maybe they have bristles, which make it hard for insects to escape the plants. As in sundews, they may make sticky secretions, which then cause insects to adhere, and the insects then gradually die and are and their nutrients can be absorbed. So some plants actually feed on insects. Some are pollinated by wind, and thus don't have those obvious flowers that I had said, while others are pollinated by animals and then have a variety of adaptations to attract the animals. There are some flowering plants which attract moths in that they only bloom at night. Some attract bats. Others are pollinated by birds. As seen here is a bananaquit, a type of bird which is pollinating flowers. So once again, plants can vary in how they are attracting their animal pollinators. Now, just there's a bunch of other variations. Certainly plants have thorns, but thorn is an odd term. See, here's a fern actually that has thorns, and that's odd for ferns. And it turns out that thorns aren't necessarily like all related to each other. So the thorns on one plant aren't necessarily composed of the same plant tissues as thorns on another plant. So thorns actually describe diverse structures which are present in different groups of plants. So thorns have evolved separately. And if we wanted to be, perhaps more anatomically correct, we could distinguish between thorns, spines, prickles. Then there are, very small hairs known as trichomes and others. So there's a variety of structures which can then protect a plant from predators, which we call thorns. Roots can certainly vary, because roots can not only develop from the primary root, but also then develop from stems. And so there are these side roots which can develop from stems, known as adventitious roots. And some plants which are, say, growing on trees, so they're these epiphytic parasites on other trees growing on the tree, then can have these roots which are trying to get water from rainwater. So orchids offer many examples of that. So here we can see plants which are growing on trees as kind of a parasite, and then have their roots adapted not for being in the soil, but rather from getting rainwater off the surface here. Then many stem systems form vines, which then, once again, can try to then grow up the side of a tree and take advantage of its height. So here's poison ivy growing very tall, very high off the ground in this tree. If you look at this thickness here, this density, these are all vines of plants which are trying to reach out to find trees and then to grow up the tree, taking advantage of their strong trunks. Once again, this doesn't help the tree, and the leaves from these vines could become such that it blocks sunlight to the plants, to the tree's leaves, and then even may add so much weight that it causes branches to break and may actually then kill the tree. So that's a strategy that some plants take. There are additional types of root systems which are meant for support. So there are some which are called buttress roots, and then there are other Other types of roots here. These are meant just to create additional support. So we can see some here. There are some very famous types of trees which provide these big buttress roots for supports, such as the ceiba tree from the Caribbean. These very thick buttress roots here make that interesting. Mangroves have these roots which can then extend the plant further into the shoreline. So mangroves grow near a coast, and then the plants can continue to advance into the water because their roots continue to go into what was once the water, and eventually this then becomes land. Some of these roots are specially adapted to take in oxygen, because otherwise, if they're trapped in the swampy water, they wouldn't have access to adequate amounts of oxygen. Certainly, and not only do plants vary, macroscopically, we can look under the microscope and see variations, in all of the the leaves, the roots, etc. So, for example, there can be root hairs from the. I'm sorry, that was the video that just passed. There can be microscopic root hairs which we see. Among other variations, certainly we can look at the differences in flower structure in terms of number of petals. And if you were trying to identify a flower, some have irregular shapes, like the pink lady slipper orchid, which grows in our area. But then there are certainly flowers which have 2 regular parts, 4 regular parts, 8 regular parts, etc. And I'll show you a website where I go through a number of these. Certainly we can talk about blooming in different seasons. There are certainly flowers which are associated with early spring, with autumn, etc. So in addition to my videos, I have a website which might help a student who's trying to get accustomed to some of these. So for example, my website is titled bio.sunyorange.edu, and the wildlife part, in the upper right here, you can see the wildlife of the Northeast. There's certainly lots of there's mammals and birds, but also I have some plant links. Here I have some links just to go through. There are flowers in the Northeast United States which have irregular parts, 2 regular parts, 3 regular parts, 4 regular parts, just some examples there. There are flowers which tend to grow in different habitats, some more swampy ground, etc. Flowers which grow in more different seasons. And so I give examples of, flowers which bloom in spring, in summer, etc. So if that's of interest here. And then also I go through identification keys. Now let me just quickly explain what an identification key is, starting with really simple ones. What you would want is to identify the species of something after answering a small number of questions. So for example, in our area, there aren't that many different kinds of club moss. That's a lycopod. And so one could then ask, if you knew it was a club moss, you could say, all right, well, there aren't that many kinds. I know that staghorn club moss has a horizontal stem above the ground and the leaves flex upwards. The tree club moss resembles a small tree. The running pine looks like this. And then you could just use these 3 and say, aha, I'm looking at running pine, based on that description. Well, that was easy. There weren't that many different kinds of club moss to choose from. In the same way, in horsetails, there's only 2 different horsetails which live in our area. With ferns, it would be a little more complex. And so you would need to answer a few more questions, but a key could potentially help you. So for example, you could ask, you find a fern, does it have a leaf axis which has no leaflets on it? So it's kind of just growing like the trunk of a tree with no side leaflets. So it's a naked leaf axis, and all of then the leaflets are located horizontally on the top of the fern. So if that's the case, so if it just grows up and then there's kind of like a horizontal set of leaflets growing out, then it's going to be one of these two, bracken fern if it's big, or the smaller maidenhair fern, okay? Is it a small fern whose leaflets are entire, meaning that they don't branch at all? Or if they do, they just have one basic lobe near the base. Well, now there's only a couple of those here, and you could then go between those. Is it a large fern that's more than 3 feet tall? In which case, now you can go here and now distinguish between those 4 kinds of fern. Or is it a medium size fern? Now, there are a couple of medium-sized ferns here, like the ones with light brown scales near the axis. Those are wood ferns. If they have lacy leaves with more than 20 leaflets, then you'd be wanting to choose between one of these 3. But in any case, what a key will do is, break, instead of going through a list of however many there are, now ask a series of questions, and then as a result of that, you can narrow down and then identify something. So for example, in the Northeast United States, with tree identification, you could ask, is it an evergreen tree with needles? In which case it's a gymnosperm. If you then wanted to know what kind of gymnosperm, do the needles, are they joined into bundles along twigs, in which case it's a pine? Do we have single needles joined to twigs, in which case it's a hemlock, fir, spruce, or yew? Or are the needles flat and scale-like, in which case it's a cedar or juniper? Once you said, oh, it's a pine because the leaves are forming these bundles, then you could ask, are there 5 needles per bundle? Are there 3 needles per bundle? And then identify, oh, okay, I'm looking at white pine. All right, and so if you found a tree and you said, oh, it's an evergreen tree with needles, then you would go here. Some trees in our area, they have what are called compound leaves. Now, I know this is a little difficult, and it takes a little bit of learning. But if you were to ask, how many leaves are here? The answer is actually just one. That is a compound leaf. So instead of having just lobes, the lobes go all the way down to the base. And if you were to look, where's the bud? Where's the swelling? There isn't a bud there, a bud there, a bud there. There's one bud at the base of that. The same thing here. Here is one single leaf. And so some leaves are what we call compound leaves, in that they have lots of leaflets, and the bud then is at the base where the leaflet attaches to the branch. And so that would be one set you'd want to distinguish between early. Am I looking at a compound leaf? Because some compound leaves are hickories, some are sumacs. All right, so all of these are leaflets. So once you knew it was a compound leaf, you could say, do I have 7 to 31 leaflets, in which case it's a sumac, 7 to 41, it's a tall tree, in which case I'm maybe looking at a walnut, a butternut, or a tree of heaven. But once again, this key could help, because now it would just put all of the compound leaf trees together. Some leaves are simple, they're not compound. All right, so the bud would be at the base of this, but they're what's called opposite. So, when you have the branch, when one leaf goes out this way, one is going out in the opposite direction. So it has simple opposite leaves. And then you could then look at that further to see whether it's a maple, it's a viburnum, etc. These all have opposite leaves. Or if that's not the case, we would say that it is alternate. So that, from your branch, you would have one leaf going out here and one leaf out here, rather than like this. They would go out like this. Those would be alternate leaves, and that would include, like birches, oaks, and the like. And then you could say, are the leaves toothless? Do the leaves have teeth or lobes? And so one of the things that many people try to do is they try to identify the tree that they're looking at, the flower that they're looking at. Here is a flower key designed by our art college's botanist, Monty Bossera, which can help them identify. So these are just some resources I have on my website, if that helps you. And then one other thing just for biology students is that if you now know how to identify trees, you could say like walk along a trail, all right? And so as I walk along this trail, so this is actual, a trail in an area known as the Bashakil. Let's say I walk this first section from here to here. There would be different tree species which I would identify. So some of them would have compound leaves. So pignut hickory looks like this. Green ash looks like that. Some would be simple opposite leaves going out like this. So sugar maple would look like this. Northern arrowwood would look like this. And so, I could go through the keys from the previous page. Some would be simple and alternate. So black oak would have lobes that have pointy teeth on them, while white oak wouldn't. And then once I get comfortable with that, I could then, just try to map out, oh, these are the trees which occur along that first section of trail. And then I could then do the same on, say, the next section of trail. Now, one of the things I have here is notice that sugar maple is one of the trees that one would see along the first section. Here I have it in green. So that would go, to that, to the simple opposite leaves, while the white oak, that was the simple alternate. And so each section of the trail could have then different trees which one tends to find. Not only might one want to study the plants along a section of a trail just to study now plant diversity, but obviously animals may depend on this as well. Now, this is a kestrel. It doesn't feed on, say, the fruits of cedar trees, but mourning doves could, and then even an opossum could. And so if you were to say hike along a trail, you might say that there were certain sections which would then encourage, populations of certain animals, but not others. Now, while snapping turtles might not respond to the fruits of juniper trees, white-tailed deer and ruffed grouse could, etc. So red squirrels and chipmunks could feed on the seeds of pine trees. And so there's such variation among plants in general, but particularly the flowering plants. And these aren't just things which affect the plants, but also the animals. The flowers have specific structures to encourage specific pollinators. The fruits and berries which are produced, can then be important food sources for specific animals, etc. And so then if you're studying the animals of an area, then the plants of the area are obviously very closely related to those. And so understanding the diversity of the plants and the significance of many of the diverse structures, they're important in understanding now the whole community of both the plants and the animals. So this was just a quick introduction into some of the resources I have on that diversity.